How big, Mark, is Apple in Turkey?
You know, they're not that big. Their market share in terms of smartphone OS usage, iOS, is very small. It's sub 20%, so it's not very significant. But this news is very significant optically. Now people are saying, why is the iPhone banned in Turkey all of a sudden? People who don't understand the trade situation, right? But what if this is also the start of a new thing where different countries are asking Apple to build iPhones locally, or they're going to start making it more difficult for them to sell? We've seen this in India already. Now we have the China and US trade war, and now we have Turkey. So is this going to continue to be a domino effect, and we'll see more of this in the future? That's the problem.
Tim Cook, Apple CEO, did meet with President Trump over the weekend. Here's a clue on what might have been discussed. Tim Cook did address the trade dispute on the earnings call a couple of weeks ago. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Our view on tariffs is that they show up as a tax on the consumer and wind up resulting in lower economic growth and sometimes can bring about significant risk of unintended consequences. That said, the trade relationships and agreements that the U.S. has between the U.S. and other major economies are very complex, and it's clear that several are in need of modernizing.
In need of modernizing. So, Romaine, Tim Cook sort of hedging a little bit there. What do you imagine transpired in this conversation with the president, and how much sway does a company like Apple have as the most valuable company in the world?
Well, it's the most valuable company in the world. It's also a major employer, and it has a major economic impact, not just on California, but on a lot of other states as well. And I think Tim Cook knows that. Also, I should point out, too, that this isn't unusual. Anytime you have a CEO of one of the largest companies in the world, you think back in the past, whether it was names like General Electric or Boeing, other companies that were sort of at the top, they all had to have good relationships with the administration that was in power at the time, in the interest of sort of furthering their business and really just making sure that the economic environment was stable enough to sort of facilitate whatever it was they were trying to sell.
So the president of Turkey has called for Turkish citizens to buy Venus smartphones, which are made by Vestel Electronics. They're pretty excited. How do their products compare to the iPhone?
Oh, I mean, it's totally two different worlds, right? The iPhone is this premium product, while these Venus smartphones are a bit lower end, more mass consumer. And if you think about the iPhone market in Turkey, I saw a stat today on Bloomberg indicating that an iPhone 10, obviously $1,000 in the US, significantly more in Turkey. It's about 5x the cost of the average income on a monthly basis for some people in Turkey, or people on minimum wage income in Turkey. So the iPhone 10 is not an affordable phone per se. Certainly not affordable in the US, but definitely not affordable to many in Turkey. Apple doesn't have as much distribution as they do in other places, only 2 Apple stores across Turkey. So in the scheme of things right now, not in the long term, in the short term, it's not a big deal. But I think the big problem long term is if other countries start, tacking on to this and are asking Apple to build things locally.
So, Romaine, given the strength of the Turkish lira in general, what is the actual purchasing power of, people living in the country to even buy American electronics in general? Yeah,
well, it's not high. I mean, keep in mind, Mark just talked about the 5 times, what the income is there. I mean, keep in mind that right now an iPhone 10, the lowest model there would be about 7,500 lira. At today's exchange rate, that's somewhere around 12 or 1,300 US dollars. So pretty pricey, particularly for an economy that just really isn't at the same level as the US. But keep in mind, even for other electronics, this really isn't a big market for imported electronics. I mean, when you think about the amount of products that Turkey imports from the U.S., electronics is about 1/10 of that, less than 1/10 of that, really. And when you get into things like smartphones and other things, it's much less than that. So this isn't really an economy that was really in a position to afford a lot of these higher end models to begin with. And now with the depreciation of the currency, it's looking less likely that they would be able to afford it, given all that's happened. So I think that the message from Erdogan is sort of moot to a certain extent, at least until this economy gets back on track. Most of its citizens probably aren't going to be able to afford these products.
Same mark for broader American electronics outside of Apple?
Right. The prices, because of the exchange rate with the Turkish lira, makes a lot of these high-end electronics simply unaffordable to many people in Turkey. And Apple's had their struggles in Turkey. This isn't the first time they had to deal with it. I'm really looking at this from the long term, the long game right now. How is this going to affect Apple in many other countries, ones that are more important to them than Turkey?